Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Cullen, and I'm the Acting Director of the University of Rochester's Susan B. Anthony Centre. The Susan B. Anthony Centre works to bring awareness to and advocate for social justice and equality. We work in collaboration with the university community and partner with a wide range of local, national, and international organizations to fulfill our goal of translating research into policy. We would like to welcome you to our panel discussion, Child Poverty, Rochester, a City in Crisis, and express our thanks to our panelists and moderator for agreeing to participate. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and we ask that you type your questions and comments in chat during the panel discussion, and the moderator will relay the questions after all panelists have spoken. Just a reminder, you can follow us on social media, Twitter at @UofR_SBAC, Facebook at URSBAC, and also we now have a YouTube channel. And I would also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge with respect the Seneca Nation, known as the Great Hill People and keepers of the Western Door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers on whose ancestral lands the University of Rochester now stands. And it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's event, Ms. Aqua Porter, MBA, Executive Director of the Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative. Ms. Porter, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, John, and nice to be here today with everyone. We're going to get right into this. I'm going to just briefly introduce the three panelists, and then in that order, they're going to share their thoughts with you, and then we'll wrap it up at the end of their time with Q&A that we take from the chat. So first, our first presenter today will be Dr. Jody Dr. Jody Todd Manley, who is the Infant Mental Health Endorsement Clinical Director for the Mount Hope Family Center. After Dr. Manley speaks, we will have Dr. Sean Nelms, who is the Superintendent of Educational Partnership Organization, Rochester City School District, William and Sheila Konar, Director for the Center for Urban Education Success at the University of Rochester. And finally, Larry Marks, who is the CEO of the Children's Agenda. Without further ado, we will go to Dr. Manley.
Thanks, Aqua. There are lots of statistics that we could present on Rochester's disparities and the demographics on child poverty and extreme poverty, which unfortunately, I imagine that a lot of people who are attending today are all too well aware. So there are a lot of other places to get that information, and I didn't figure the people who registered for this panel discussion would want to hear a lot about statistics. I'm so glad that we started today with acknowledging the Seneca peoples and the land on which Rochester stands. And I think that we would be remiss to have this discussion on child poverty without also acknowledging and naming the policies that redlining and hiring practices and disparities in healthcare and education and policing and court and other systems that have really been built on structural racism that has been a driving force in preventing Black and brown families from having opportunities that may have helped them to build resources and financial stability that could have been passed down to generations. So I could also speak about the considerable research that's been done on the negative effects of child poverty on child development across multiple domains: physical health, social and emotional development, educational achievement, etc. But I have 10 minutes, and so I didn't want to talk about numbers. I wanted to talk about people. And I don't know what image comes to mind for you all when you think about poverty. But for me, what comes to mind is struggle. And it's been enough of a struggle for all of us in the midst of multiple pandemics to think about stresses and all that we're all trying to overcome. But when I think about people who are in the struggle with poverty, and particularly the parents and the families that we work with at Mount Hope Family Center, what comes to mind is that idea of that additional overlay of struggle on top of all of the other stresses, and parents who are trying to make a better life for themselves and their children, and yet they're struggling to find stable housing that's affordable. And maybe when they find an apartment to live in, then they find out that there are environmental toxins like lead in their environment because of housing conditions that may have had lifelong health consequences for their children's health, or that they find themselves living in a neighborhood with community violence, which perpetuates intergenerational cycles of trauma that they were trying to break and get out of. Or the struggles of parents who are trying to make a better life for their families by working 2 or 3 jobs, only to find that then they have no time to actually be with their children and enjoy time together. Or maybe they're working a night shift and it's hard to stay awake when the children are awake because they've been up all night. Or children are having to be shuffled among a hodgepodge of caregivers and babysitters because the parents are having a hard time finding childcare when they're working night shift. Or in some cases, parents out of desperation have ended up taking their children to work with them because they had no place for the children to go, only to have tragic consequences like the child who died after falling into a grease pit at the restaurant where the parent was working. So thinking about the struggles that parents have with choices of how do I work and try and make ends meet when a large part of my salary is going to pay for the high costs of childcare. So maybe they don't know how to afford working, but they can't afford not to work. Or maybe they decline promotions so they don't fall off that benefits cliff and make just a little bit too much money to qualify for the services that their family needs. And although we have a lot of really high quality pre-K and early childhood education programs in Rochester, they may not be accessible because of costs or because of schedules or because of location. And then the child care providers themselves that are working in those early childhood programs are also struggling with poverty because of low rates of pay, and certainly less than the $15 an hour minimum that is now being discussed as a living wage. And thinking about the emotional impact of going to bed hungry and not knowing when where or when your next meal is coming, or being in pain and not being able to go to the doctor. And that could be the children's experience. It could also be the experience of the parents who prioritize their children's needs over their own. So parents are struggling with lots of difficult choices. I will mention a little bit of research. I participated in a summit last week on translating evidence into practice and implementing and sustaining best practices in child maltreatment prevention and early intervention. And one of the presenters talked about research on associations between economic resources and child maltreatment and CPS involvement. And by that, I'm not just talking about distinguishing between poverty and neglect, but also how there have been some experimental programs where adjusting policies related to things like earned income tax credits and child support and minimum wage have affected rates of child abuse and neglect and CPS involvement in foster care placement rates in various states and countries where those programs have been tried, and finding that the probability of child neglect and abuse increases as income drops. But conversely, making money more directly available to families can reverse those trends. So I don't have the answers to how to solve the problems of poverty in our community. I'm hoping maybe our other panelists have those answers. But what I do know is that about 15 years ago, there were some funders and some policymakers and some community members that got together, and they started asking, what if? What if, rather than waiting for a crisis where CPS has to be called and children are placed in foster care, what if we look upstream? And what if we find ways of supporting children and families before they get to a crisis point? And what if we found ways in our community of supporting young families to help them get on a more positive path with a dual generation approach that addresses the needs of the parent as well as the child before that crisis? And what if our community really invested in prevention? And what if we used the opportunities that are presented when parents become pregnant or when they first have a child, that opportunity for a new start, knowing that sometimes people are able or willing to do things for their children, to give their children a better life that maybe they weren't able to do for themselves because of their own history of trauma, because of feeling that they were stuck in a rut, feeling helpless and hopeless about how to get out of that. And what if we came up with a way to have people from similar backgrounds and neighborhoods who looked like these young families, who could reach out to young moms and build trust, help them to find more stable housing, help them get to their medical appointments or connect with their medical homes, help them complete their education or build their job skills to promote some self-sufficiency, help link them with services. And what if we could have the services that were needed to address maternal depression or family trauma or understanding of parenting skills and make that a one-stop shop instead of like a jigsaw puzzle of service providers in different agencies, some with long wait lists? What if these services could come to the families through home visitation, so that moms who may be struggling with depression, who had a hard time getting out and connecting with outside services, might be able to get the supports that they need in a seamless way, so that it really connected with where their needs were at any given point in time. And what if those ideas could be evaluated so that we could look at whether this team approach with outreach community health workers and therapists trained in multiple evidence-based models that could shift according to parents' needs actually worked to help prevent child abuse and neglect, to help improve outcomes for children and families. So this group of people that started asking these what if questions and came up with creative problem-solving ideas. This is actually how Building Healthy Children was born. And Building Healthy Children is a program that serves young families through this team approach to home visitation. And it has been evaluated, and we found that it actually helped to reduce maternal depression, to improve parenting, and improve children's emotional and behavioral functioning, not only when they were in the program, but years later when they were in elementary school. And those changes were noted not only by the parents, but also by their teachers. So we don't know whether the families that are served in Building Healthy Children have been able to escape poverty and will be able to be self-sufficient in the years moving forward, and whether their children will be able to. But we know that a lot of parents in the program have completed school, in some cases with advanced degrees. Many of them have gotten jobs and reported in improvements in many areas. So I think as a community, we need to keep asking what if, and determine what can be done to help support children and families for a better future.
Thank you, Dr. Manley. That was great. I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Sean Nelms, who I'm sure can add to this discussion and maybe provide some additional thoughts on solutions.
Thanks, Aqua. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Todd Manley, for those opening comments. I'm going to probably be less than 10 minutes. So I want to make sure Larry gets his in and talk from a policy standpoint, so we have plenty of time for Q&A. But I want to start and expand upon something that Dr. Todd Manley said earlier when she said she wants to move from numbers to people. And I wanted to extend that and talk about people to systems, the systems in which people live in. And I also want to just delineate the difference between poverty and having a mindset of being poor. So if we can accept that poverty is defined by a measure associated with income, and then also separate that from people within poverty having a poor mindset, I kind of want to start there. And I can say that from someone who lived most of his life, most of his youth, living well below the poverty line in Buffalo, New York. And it wasn't that those in the community, at least the way in which we operated daily, thought much about being in poverty because we didn't have a poor mindset, because everyone around us had the same economic base. What we found within our community was that there were systems and structures in place that allowed us to navigate through the education system, through healthcare, through housing, through workforce development, and social-emotional support. So my challenge to the community is, to what extent are we combining our efforts to ensure that those folks living below the poverty line are not adopting a poor mentality simply because they don't know where to get help, and that the issues that they identify as their greatest needs aren't being addressed because we're doing things to them and not with and for them. So I think this is really important for me because I think about poverty that way. Hopefully it's a temporary place, and it's the community itself of those who are living in poverty who will help define the pathways out of that economic condition. There's an African proverb that I'm often reminded of that says, a child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. So a child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. When we entered, we meaning the University of Rochester, entered East High School 6 years ago, what we encountered was a broken village. A broken village defined by the teaching staff, by the support staff, by parents, but most importantly, the students. What we found is that people were associating their definition of a poor person's mentality to how we were supporting our youth, okay? Meaning that the vehicles and pathways out of poverty were not present. There wasn't a strong curriculum that was designed to help students better navigate the world around them, not just academically, but also socially, politically. We found in that system that we were lacking social-emotional support. We know that with poverty comes stress and often depression and anxiety, and there were not avenues to help support students and their families navigate the pressures of living below the poverty line, especially when things became very stressful. And so we partnered with the School of Nursing to bring in therapists to support students who had high rates of ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, and kids who had self-identified as being in a temporary or permanent traumatic state. We understood that the importance of healthcare, and we partnered with the Flamme Institute and the Eastman Institute of Oral Health to provide eyeglasses and also oral care to students who had tooth pain, but also had a hard time actually seeing the boards in which we were asking them to be successful students. We furthered that partnership with FoodLink to ensure that not only were kids being nurtured within school, but they were being nourished outside of school and being able to take bags of food home every day or on the weekends with menus inside to teach kids how to not only eat the food, but how to cook it themselves. So they created a sense of resiliency for not themselves, but also for for their families. And last but certainly not least, we did a school-wide restorative practices approach so that we could better understand why students were disengaged, but more importantly, why adults stopped engaging them. And there was a huge tension between what adults thought they were doing for students and how students were receiving it, children in this case, and what students said they actually needed to be able to lean into how schools work. So when we talk about children in poverty, without understanding what children in poverty need and desire and are asking for, we're bound to miss the mark every single time. So my solution is to do and adopt a few things that we worked on at EASE. One is to change our mindset around what poverty looks like within our community. And that this is not a deficit model, that these families are just drowning in despair, but these are parents who've lived through a lived experience, know which parts of the system prevent them from moving forward. So listening to those blockers and try to prevent and create roadblocks and opening on the doors for that. I would suggest that we lean into the children, especially those who can articulate themselves, to ask what do they need. The minute that we found funding to give kids summer jobs, we had a line outside the principal's office asking kids to come in and clean in the summer and work in the summer and throughout the school year because they wanted to work. And they wanted to not only work to take care of their families, but to take care of themselves and to be able to save for college or life after. And I would say last but not least, it was our effort in making sure that we sat in rooms with healthcare professionals, with those who are responsible for housing in our community, to partner better with the city and local government, so that when opportunities were being discussed, that it was our children's faces that would be represented at that table, so that decisions weren't made devoid of a context from those living in poverty. And I think what often happens, I heard someone say this recently, is that we ignore the context experts in our community, which are our families and our students, and we rely solely on the content experts who really, for most part, haven't lived a day in their shoes. And so throughout this discussion, through the Q&A, and hopefully as we continue to have discussion in the community, I hope that we take time to honor the content and the content experts, that we take some time to reflect on the extent to which we honor the words and desires of those that we seek to serve, and that we change our mindset in understanding that poverty is defined by an economic standard. It is not defined, or does not define the mindset of those who are living in poverty. I think if we can move forward in that direction and help those who are in places to create change through policy and also through organizational restructuring, and with those folks at the center of those decisions, I think we're better able to support children in poverty and their families, so they can live a prosperous life and give back to this community in meaningful ways. Thanks.
So many good, really powerful comments and thoughts, Sean. Thank you so much. There's some good questions coming in. I just want to encourage people as they have questions to put them in the chat, and then we'll come back and circle back around to them. But last but not least, Larry, can you start to talk a little bit about policies and other ways that are being thought about to help children and families that are facing some of those financial challenges and the other parts of poverty?
I can, and if I'm technologically savvy enough, I could even show some slides that I have for policies. So let's see.
We have faith in you, Larry.
Can you all see that? Okay.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank Dr. Manley and Dr. Nelms. It's really an honor to be on the panel with them. My shtick, as Aqua pointed out, is policy change. And I would argue that that's the answer really to child poverty, and that's the long-term sustainable at scale best way to address it. So I'm going to take you through 4 points about just a little background on the Children's Agenda, why advocate for policy change, how and why it's worked in the past, and what we need to do now. So our job at Children's Agenda, we're a small agency locally based in Rochester. We have 11 staff, is to advocate for effective policies and drive evidence-based solutions for the health, education, and success of children, especially those who are most vulnerable because of poverty, racism, health inequities, and trauma. And we were founded by the Community Foundation after a 1.5-year-long planning process to fill a vacuum missing in the community around 3 needed ingredients. One was advocacy. There's a lot of organizations and efforts that advocate that are usually about, hey, we're a great organization or a great program. If you give us more funding, we'll do bigger, better, faster. We don't take any government funding, and our job was designed to focus on the system as opposed to any particular program. We have some expertise in evidence base, and we do a lot of research, particularly around how government budgets are spent in smart or not so smart ways to further advance children. And then we were created, God help us, to focus on the entire prenatal to young adulthood continuum and to build systems around all the different misconnects and disconnects between that. So enough about us. So the question is, why advocacy? And what I would say is that program and practice interventions can help individuals beat the odds. And that's important, and we need to do everything we can to make that happen. But policy interventions can change the odds for all. So there's a difference between ameliorating hard facts, like the fact that 48% of children in this community live in poverty. That's the highest rate of any comparably sized city in the country, or that 15% live in very deep poverty, also one of the highest and worst rates. There's a difference between ameliorating those hard facts and changing them. And this is not some law of gravity or second law of thermodynamics that people are fated to live in poverty. This is a human-made problem. There are human-made solutions. And as we'll see, it's happened elsewhere. Empirically, there's evidence to show that we can cut child poverty in half. As Martin Luther King said, poverty should not be accepted as a necessary evil or an insoluble problem. All it takes is resources and public will. So just quickly about advocacy, there are some change strategies that help maintain the existing system and others that change the existing system. And then there are some that create faster individual results and some that create slower population results. And so this is just a way of encapsulating that old Catholic phrase, which was, if you want to help a hungry person, you can give them a fish and they'll eat for a day. Or if you want them to eat for the rest of their lives, teach them how to fish. So there's direct service, there's self-help, there's educating public opinion. There are social change movements, which not only change policy, but change politics, not only politics, but our culture, as we're seeing happening now with Black Lives Matter and civil rights movements of the past, women's movements, labor movements. And then just short of that, there are things that we can do in the here and now to change poverty. What this chart shows, this is from a 600-page study that Congress ordered 5 years ago and was fulfilled by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, where they were asked the question, what are the suite of public policy changes that we could implement that would reduce child poverty in half? It was a bipartisan commission, a bipartisan study. And they pointed to the fact that the United Kingdom cut its child poverty rate in half from 2001 to 2008, that Canada's child benefit program is on its way to cut child poverty in half. And by the way, in the United States, from 1967 to 2016, we cut child poverty nearly in half. But if you look at this chart, the most poor people in this country didn't used to be children, they used to be elderly. And in 1935, we passed the Social Security Act. So we went from 30% rate of elderly people in poverty down to less than 10% today. And that's an example of how poverty reduction is achievable. And so the question is, what does it take? And the genius of social change, our own Frederick Douglass, talked about power. And he made the point that decision makers aren't necessarily missing certain facts. They're not, although they might be, they're not necessarily missing a moral imperative, although they might be. What they're responding to, by and large, is power. And he made the point that if there is no struggle, there's no progress. Power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, and it never will. So power comes down to organized money and or people, organized people. And that's what really sways large decisions like Social Security in 1935 or things that we're facing today. And here's an example of changing the odds, of not just beating them, but completely changing them. New York State 5 years ago created the best paid family leave policy in the country. 6.4 million mothers are able, and fathers are able to take off to care for their newborns or newly adopted infants, thanks to a family leave policy that provides 12 weeks of wages. So instead of the usual stress of, do I take care of my kid and do what's best for my kid, or do I keep the job? This helps eliminate that. It's the best family leave policy in the country. And it has a transformational impact on healthy starts. So newborns and newly adopted kids are bonding with their parents. It reduces maternal depression. There's longer time spent breastfeeding, and it reduces chronic family stress, which helps children's development immensely. So one of the things that we have to do with public policy is pay particular attention to whether it's undercutting structural racism or reinforcing it. So even in 1935, the Social Security Act only covered about half the workers in the economy at the time. So it left out women because of the definition of what work meant and because of job discrimination in workplaces, and didn't account for the fact that women drop out of the workplace in order to have children and raise them and then come back in. So they lose wages and Social Security earnings. And most importantly, African Americans, 65% were excluded because they fell into two categories that were eliminated: agricultural and domestic workers. And those exclusions helped to entrench the poverty that we see today in rural areas. And so any universal policy has to be targeted, also has to help lift particularly African American and other people of color, and help women and help the poorest of the poor, which happens to be the youngest of the young. So one example of changing the odds is legislation right now called the End Child Poverty Act, Assembly Bill 1160, sponsored by Harry Bronson, that would actually be the first codification in law of any state in the country to set a goal to cut child poverty in half in New York State within 10 years, with a special emphasis on racial inequity. So it suggests evidence-based strategies, it establishes public benchmarks, and whether it's the goal of putting a man on the moon in 10 years or the goal of being carbon neutral by 2040, establishing goals in law really matter. That's one thing that we can do. Another thing that we can do is very exciting right now, that in the next month, we have a once in a lifetime opportunity to lift as many as 24 million children out of poverty with the stroke of a pen. President Biden's American Rescue Plan makes the child tax credit fully refundable. Right now, 24 million children are too poor to qualify for that $2,000 tax credit. Who does it hit the worst? The exclusions are half of Black and Hispanic children don't qualify for all of it, and 1 in 5 Black kids get none of it. This would raise the refund to $3,600 for every child under 6 and $3,000 for every child from 7 to 8. And that's minimally going to mean 224,000 fewer children in poverty in New York State. It's not perfect. It should be dispersed monthly. There should be an advance to pregnant women 4 months before delivery. And frankly, it needs to be permanent and not just 1 year only for the terms of the pandemic. But our hope is once established, it can make a big difference. And Senator Chuck Schumer has agreed to make it, is really fighting for this as a bottom line in the US Senate. And so what's next on the agenda? Childcare. Less than 17%, it's actually 12% of New York State families are eligible, who are eligible for assistance, get any help. That leaves out 536,000 children. The demand in the Finger Lakes region exceeds supply for children under 6 by almost 33,000 slots. And it's just out of reach. Unlike most other countries in the world, the United States does not have an early child care and education system that is supported adequately by government. And that is, we have a child care availability task force from New York State that's about to make its recommendations public. And like paid family leave, which took 10 years to campaign for and win, that's the next horizon of what we need to work on. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Dr. Sean. Thank you, Dr. Todd Manley. There are a bunch of questions. I think I'm going to start with trying to kind of summarize some questions into some themes and asking the panelists to address them. So I think, Sean, this one's specifically for you. There was a question around, do you know of any plans to replicate the East High School model to kind of elementary schools?
Great question. So let me just say this. East was, the plan for East was designed and defined by the people at East, meaning before we began, we surveyed the parents and students. We also surveyed staff, and then looked at some of the research around school transformation. And so I'm always careful to talk about replication because I think the context of East created some unique opportunities for East. So yes, there have been plans to help an elementary school within Rochester, School 33 specifically. It's supposed to have occurred 3 or 4 years ago, where we were going to do the same type of school scan to help identify the strengths of the school, but also some opportunities for growth, and then align. So we had a pre-K through 12 pipeline. Unfortunately, that has not happened. And reason being is I have worked with 6 superintendents in my 6 years at East, including the interims. And so every time we get started on that project, it gets delayed or it gets moved. And so that's not a school that we have control over, so we couldn't force it. But there is a board MOU that was to establish that partnership. But our desire, when I say our, I mean the University of Rochester's and specifically the Center for Urban Education Success, our desire is to help other schools in Rochester better understand the context in which they are functioning, and then to help them design a plan that is unique for that individual school. There are some fundamental things that should be placed in all schools. Again, a focus on social-emotional health, a focus on having a viable and guaranteed curriculum that's reflective of the students, a focus on making sure that students have voice and that parents are true partners at the table. And then also that the adults in the building are empowered to do what's right morally and ethically to give all kids a successful education experience. Those are fundamental. But then you have some other unique opportunities that you can use in schools to expand upon that work. A focus on reading, a focus on math. A lot of these principles we embedded at East. And so our desire is to continue to partner with 33, or I guess to begin that partnership, but also to look for other opportunities to support schools. It is important to note that other schools throughout the city have reached out and participated in our professional development for teachers. They are currently looking at the curriculum to see if it's if they desire to use that in other schools. We've also supported suburban and rural schools all throughout Monroe County also, and I can talk about that later. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Todd Manley, there was a question around specifically getting some more information on the Healthy Family Program, but there was also a comment that other models like this have been in place before. Specifically, someone called out the Family Literacy Program that was sponsored by the Rochester City School District at one point, which is no longer in place, and the Harlem Children's Zone. And there were just questions about, you know, kind of what would it take to expand those? Do you have any comments on, you know, what made those successful or not? Can you talk about that?
Sure, I can speak to that. I think one of the lessons learned from our Building Healthy Children program is that it's very difficult to come up with a one-size-fits-all model when you have so many different needs of children and families. So I think there do need to be an array of choices available. I think the problem with Rochester, though, is sometimes there are, you know, a whole array of different programs and services, and it's very challenging for families to navigate, you know, which ones am I eligible for? If I am eligible, how do I get access to those services? And different programs that have different funding streams, and sometimes programs come and go, which I think is a concern as well. And I was involved in the Rochester Children's Zone when that was an attempt made to take the Harlem Children's Zone and bring it here to Rochester. And we could have a whole nother hour talking about the pros and cons of that. But to Sean's point, you know, one of the champions of that program was one of the superintendents who subsequently left. And so I think that was difficult in terms of sustaining leadership for that program, among other challenges. And so I think sometimes then the community gets initiative fatigue and gets tired of the latest and greatest shiny object getting a lot of focus, but not necessarily being sustained. So there are a lot of great programs in our community. I won't say that Building Healthy Children is the only one by any stretch, but I think that we do need to keep looking at innovative practices as well as tried and true, proven, you know, what works best, and to keep investing our resources in those things that work best and that are a good fit for the families that help to meet their needs. And we know that there are a lot of families out there struggling, especially struggling right now in the midst of the pandemic. And we want to think long-term, not just think about what's going to be successful, you know, this year, but what's going to help kids 10, 15 years from now. What do we do now to build the supports and the skills and the resources for them so that ultimately they can become successful contributing members to our community, because they deserve it. And I see behind Larry's picture on the wall there that kids can't wait. So we need to really be paying attention to their needs now.
I know, can I jump in real fast? I just want to highlight two things that were said. One is the Harlem Zone experience, right? That was the Harlem Zone-like experience in Rochester, and that was happening in the Crescent. And that's a great example of a program being established that did not necessarily match the desires of the context experts, the people in the community. When we get to a point when the context experts are the ones who are driving, then it does become a person-dependent initiative, that if a leader leaves, then the initiative falls. And that happens a ton in Rochester. The second thing I want to say is I want to commend four funding groups publicly: the William Sheena Konar Foundation, Wegmans, Sands, and ESL, who just recently put out an RFP. And the purpose of the RFP was to force a reliance or force organizations to work together, and they would fund strategy, not programs. And that they would fund strategy that is sustainable, that has to be anchored within the community's voice. And I commend them for that, because by their own acknowledgement, they said, we keep funding these programs. And then they come and they go. And they got to a point and they said, what if we pulled our money together and we fund strategy in a way that honors the community and provides a different perspective and a different demand for how organizations must work together to address these critical problems. I think it's a start of something that, quite frankly, hasn't happened consistently over time here in Rochester. And I think it's a move in the right direction. So thanks for giving me some time just to kind of spot. I saw a couple of questions around that too, around asylum.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for jumping in. Does anybody else have any thoughts about that?
Well, I'll mention one thing, which is that one of the reasons programs come and go is not only the 6 superintendents in 6 years, but programs usually get to scale, meeting the whole need. They become sustainable over time, regardless of the changes in decision makers. And they get integrated with other programs through policy change. Without that policy change, they can be standalone silos. So I was also glad to see in the RFP that one of the things that the 4 funders said is a priority is focusing on policy change or advocacy for policy change. Because I think that's how you get scale in programs and practices. That's how you get sustainability. And that's the only way that you get it to be having on-ramps and off-ramps and bridges and connections to other initiatives in the community. Otherwise, it's standalone.
Hey, Larry, so while you're speaking, I'm gonna let you maybe weigh in on this. So somebody asked, is policy a part of the problem? In that, do we create guidelines that sometimes limit people who can take part in some of the programs from being able to access it, maybe arbitrarily or because the consequences aren't well thought out? And so does the policy become both an opportunity and a problem?
Absolutely. I mean, policy, I would argue that the poverty is human-made by policy. The reason why a child tax credit doesn't extend to the lowest income people, 24 million kids, is because of a political decision. Political decisions, both the absence of the right decision and the presence of the wrong decisions. Jody referenced the redlining and the lack of home mortgage loans for African-American people in this community for decades. So it's not just absence of good policy, it's also presence of bad policy.
All right, so this question, I think I will let anyone answer this. And so this was kind of a statement made by someone that said that people who often are lifted out of poverty look at education as making the difference. Is just ensuring that everybody that graduates from the Rochester City School District has the right skills to, navigate life. Is that the most important thing? Anybody want to comment on education as the differentiator between being in poverty and not? Was that the secret sauce?
I can take a stab. So I would say it depends on how we define education. So, and then the quality of education. So as I mentioned at East, when we first began, I mentioned that at East we first began, the graduation rate the year prior was 29%. And by January of our first year, the graduation rate was trending towards 19%. Now, through systemic change and teacher buy-in and student buy-in and curriculum changes, that graduation rate 5 years later was 78%. So I would say when we were at 78%, then yeah, education mattered for those kids. We were at 19%, absolutely not. So the quality of education matters. And also education beyond the X and O's in school, education around the social pathways towards difference making. So I got my lesson in social capital when I was in college, watching kids from all over the state attend a state school of privilege And they had access to things I had no idea about and never heard of. And I went to one of the best high schools in the country, City Honors in Buffalo. And so there is education, not just from books, but also like education that prepares our students to know how to navigate in the world around them, but also for them to navigate that world without losing themselves. And we often see students lose their true nature because they're not validated in school or in the workplace. And so they think that with who they are and how they were raised is somewhat an impediment to their success. And so education to me, it comes in many different forms. And so we have to make sure that in the schoolhouse, our kids are reflected in the curriculum and it's rigorous and challenging and they're supported. And then as they navigate through life, that they're educated enough to know how to navigate, to avoid pitfalls, but to also bring their authentic self to the table so they can educate others around them. So when the next generation of folks like them come to those spaces, that workplace or that job environment or that college is ready for them also. There's a great burden that people of color carry to not just be successful in the present, but to make sure everything you do is preparing for the next generation of kids in the future. It's a heavy burden and we all take that on. I'm hoping that pressure becomes less and less required of us as we move forward so we can live a free and happy life like our peers.
Well, how about, that's kind of a great segue, because there are people who want to get involved and want to know how they can help. And so if you just think about, Sean, having environments where people can bring their authentic selves to the table and be their authentic selves, how can people that are maybe a part of this conversation today help in their own environments, making people feel like they can come with their own authentic selves? Is that a place to start?
Yeah, I think, and I think I saw Eva Thomas write something in the chat. It says, about time we're not doing things for parents, we're doing things with them. I think it's the same thing in the workplace. I think taking time to understand the individuals who you work with is more important than trying to force your narrative upon them, right? So taking time to understand the context of those that you hire, so that when you are engaged with them professionally or personally, they don't have to silence themselves for fear of being a standout or for being fired or being demoted. Like, we all bring a certain, they're hired because they have a skill set. Don't have them then silence who they are as a person too, to fit your narrative. So if you want to help by learning about others before making judgments, seek first to understand and to be understood, and then influence in private when those folks aren't present, the other people around them, so they do the same. There's always a fear for people of color who feel like there's the conversation that happens when we're not in the room. And those are the most telling and dangerous conversations because we're not there. And people who pretend to be allies don't speak up in those moments. So if you really want to change the workplace or change the work environment, be as Tina Love would say, a co-conspirator. Speak up in our presence and also speak up in our absence. More importantly, in our absence, so that when we are present, that there's an authentic environment that's accepting of us and that honors who we are as individuals, professionally and personally.
I'd love to hear maybe Dr. Todd Manley or Larry Marks to kind of weigh in on that same conversation about, getting involved and having people get involved and what that might look like.
Well, I really appreciate all that that Sean is sharing, and I think that if we get back to the education question too, I think we can't wait for education to start in first grade. I think education starts way beyond that, starting even prenatally, and looking at the ways we educate our young children. And it's not just about the academics. It's how do we support children in feeling good about themselves, and helping them to learn how to regulate their emotions, how to deal with interpersonal situations, including how do we teach conflict resolution skills. And there are so many ways that if children are just viewed as, we put them into schools and they have to just sit and listen, rather than helping them learn how to think and how to feel comfortable with who they are and who they are in community and in relationship with other people. So that needs to permeate throughout all of the interactions, supporting people as individuals in wherever the environments are, and supporting the importance of relationships.
Larry, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I would say that change comes, again, according to Frederick Douglass, when people demand it at a policy level. And that in order for people to do that, they need to have a sense of self-agency, which I hear Dr. Nelms and Dr. Manley addressing, and also an opportunity of where they can make a difference, and sometimes an invitation. So that means at a policy level of knowing, hearing that there is a child tax credit extension, and knowing that now's the time to weigh in on members of Congress and our US senators to make that difference, again, a once in a lifetime moment. That means really actually calling and meeting with legislators, joining with organizations that lead that up. That's incredibly important because that is going to make the difference. There's a reason why paid family leave passed after 10 years in New York State, and that's because enough people got behind it and demanded it.
That's awesome. I would just like to, at this point, take a point of privilege and really to congratulate and applaud the University of Rochester. One of the things that we talk about in poverty is, we talked earlier at the very onset about this, about getting money in the hands of people as one of the other levers that we can use to try to start to eradicate poverty. And University of Rochester has just announced a really bold step in setting $15 as the minimum wage for their employees. And that's not a policy decision that has been taken. They haven't, responded to a policy that's changed in New York State. This was really work that they have done. And I think it's an enormous, courageous and bold step in our community. And I just wanted to take a moment to applaud them for that. So congratulations to them. I know we were at the very top of the hour. There were some excellent questions that we didn't get to, John, but I'm going to turn it back over to you so we can end on time and okay. Let you wrap us up.
Thank you very much, Ekwa. I appreciate it. And thank you everyone who attended. We probably could have stayed on for another 60 minutes to engage in this rich dialogue. And we know that these, solutions don't happen overnight, but we hope that those who attended will continue the conversation. And again, it's your sphere of influence and who you share these stories with. It's very important. So I want to take the opportunity, and I know Dr. Nelms has to go right on to a 5 o'clock panel. So I want to take the opportunity to thank Ms. Porter and Dr. Todd Manley, Dr. Nelms, and Mr. Marks for taking the time out of their day to have this critical discussion with us. And again, as I said, we urge you to keep it going. This webinar has been recorded. We will be adding closed captions and uploading it to our YouTube channel, where you will find it probably in a couple of weeks. And we also have some other previous webinars on there around racism and wages and various other topics. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and especially our panelists and moderator, and I wish everyone a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.